Hi, I'm Jerome Cousins, and this podcast is about why the USA and the USSR became rivals in the periods of 1945 to 1950. Nearly all the rivalries between the US and the USSR in the Cold War can be boiled down to the cold hard fact that the US was capitalist and that the USSR was communist, and that the two ideologies could not peacefully coexist as world powers. Between 1945 and 1950, the two sides became increasingly paranoid about each other, each with their own very justified reasons. First of all, the Potsdam Conference in 1945 divided up Germany into four parts: the East, controlled by the USSR, and the West, controlled by France, the UK, and the US. Each zone was to be governed by their respective countries. However, Berlin, Germany's largest city and capital, was located far over on the eastern USSR-controlled side. Berlin was also divided into four different sections, similarly to Germany itself. The West was to be granted 3 highways and 3 air corridors in and out of Berlin, in order to import the provisions needed to keep Berlin running. The Potsdam Conference was also when Truman informed Stalin that the US had the atomic bomb, and was planning on using it against Japan. The fear of communism in the US was on a constant rise, and the US designated itself the mission of defending Europe from the advancing Soviet influence. The Truman Doctrine gave military finance to Greece and Turkey in order to crush any communist parties attempting to seize power. However, this was only the first step. The Marshall Plan was announced in 1947 and promised economic aid to countries in need, on condition that they would fight any communist influence in the country. Evidently, none of this was very well received by Stalin and the USSR, who nevertheless continued its expansion in the Eastern European nations. The Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine only resulted in increasing rivalry between the two powers. Just by having an atomic bomb, the US increased rivalries between the two countries. With the threat of nuclear retaliation, the USSR could not take any severe military action against the US for fear of having what happened in Japan happen to them as well. Japan was a clear warning shot for the USSR, and they were no fools in realizing this. On February 22, 1946, an American named Keenan, who was stationed in Moscow, wrote a document entitled The Long Telegram. In it, he summarized his interpretation of the views of the Soviets, and in particular Stalin. He claimed Stalin believed himself and the USSR at constant war with capitalism, and that eventually military force might be warranted. It has been said that the entire US foreign policy in regards to the USSR was based on this single long telegram, and is why the US was so uncooperative with the USSR. Finally, the tipping point that clearly established the two powers as rivals was the Berlin blockade from the 24th of June to 1948 until the 11th of May 1949. Just beforehand, the US had established a new currency in West Berlin, Deutschmark, as a step forwards in establishing Germany as its own independent state with a stable economy. The USSR responded by creating its own currency in West Berlin, but seeing its futility in lowering the value of the Deutschmark, they cut off all highways going into Berlin from the west. This completely crippled West Berlin. Complete shortage of food, coal, and electricity was imminent, and the USSR was intent on forcing the US to agree to cooperate together on a new Germany. The US refused, and the blockade continued. So began the Berlin Airlift. Planes were incessantly flown into West Berlin via the air corridors, with one plane landing approximately every 45 seconds, and eventually flying in more than the minimum 5,000 tons of supplies per day required to keep West Berlin afloat. The USSR, realizing their ploy had failed, reopened the highways for convoys in May 1949. By blockading the citizens of West Berlin, the USSR gave itself the image of an enemy to much of Europe and the US, and the US's continuous policy of non-cooperation made peaceful resolutions difficult. The long Cold War that followed was a direct consequence of these rivalries, miscommunication, and general stubbornness.